Gracias Gaby, gracias Patti. Hola a todos y todos y mucho en esta charla. Desde este momento voy a cambiar a inglés para continuar con esta presentación. So, hi everyone, thanks for being here on the second day of XConf Latin America. I'm Fausto de la Torre, as Patti and Gaby introduced me. Thank you so much for that. And this keynote presentation is going to be a little bit different than a regular presentation. It will be more a conversation discussion between us. And it's a pleasure for me to introduce you all to Martin Fowler, with whom we will talk about this very interesting topic about software architecture. Hi Martin, how are you today? You're muted, Martin.
I'm pretty good, thank you. I'm sorry about forgot to unmute my thing there. Up here in Boston, it's the autumn or the fall as we call it. I know you don't have seasons down in Ecuador, but if you take a walk outside, it looks something like this out there where I live. So it's a really lovely time of the year here in Boston.
That is absolutely true. I love those cities with seasons. You can change the mood time to time. That's great. So, software architecture, huh? Again, about this topic. I think we have talked about this a long time, but is it still controversial, especially with new advances in tools, frameworks, techniques that make the role of the architect and what we conceive about architecture a little bit different, I think. And I would like to start this discussion, this conversation, Martin, with the terminology first. So what do you think about this term, software architecture? Is it the right analogy? Can we call ourselves architects in this software world?
Well, it's a very interesting analogy for me personally. Because, and the reason for this is, in particular, is because my wife is a structural engineer. And the relationship between structural engineers and architects in the building world is a very difficult one, particularly when we first met, because at the time she was working in what structural engineers call horizontals, bridges and roads and things like that. And the role of an architect in those kinds of projects is referred to, at least around here in North America, as the 3 Bs: bulbs, bridges, and bushes. Bulbs, birds, and bushes. Basically, it's all decorative. No one cares anything about architecture there. And so I could really never refer to myself as an architect with her, because she'd have no respect for me. But she's since moved into the area of verticals, which is buildings. And there, architects do play a much more important role. But it's very different to the role that we give architecture in software. Because in the building work, architects are all about how people use spaces and interact with spaces. So the equivalent in the software world would be in user experience, very much in the how users relate to the software. The role that we class architects as are much more like the structural engineers or the people who are designing electrical systems or plumbing systems, more internal stuff rather than external stuff. So we've taken a fancy word from the building area, I think, because it was a fancy word and because it has a, there are famous architects in the world, but not so many famous engineers. And we've nicely misused the metaphor as well. Oh well, that is the software world, I guess.
Yes, that's actually true. When I am talking about software architect with people that are not in this world, it's kind of weird. I remember I was talking with my grandma and she said something like, okay, please tell me what you do. You call yourself a software architect, so what kind of buildings do you build? So like, yes, I'm trying to explain to someone that is not in that world is It's kind of hard. I think it's our own thing. But let's go to some definitions. Ralph Johnson, and I think you agree with this statement, that he has said that architecture, software architecture, is about the important stuff, right? And when we said the important stuff could sound a little bit vague. Important stuff could mean anything, right? What is important for me, maybe it's not important to you, maybe it's not important to someone else. And so we can say that importance is relative in this context. However, I think that making this statement relative, it's key, right? It's key that a team define what is important for them. It's key that the team have the same understanding about what software architecture is for them. So why is that important? What is important that a team define what software architecture is for them and not having an absolute definition?
Well, the reason we don't have an absolute definition is because it changes from environment to environment. Depending on the kind of software you're building, and again, we think of software here in a very broad sense. I mean, we at ThoughtWorks tend to focus on commercial software. A lot of things like websites and things of that kind is kind of our bread and butter. But I mean, a lot of the people that I interacted with when we were talking about architecture in the software patterns community came from telecom systems, and they build telephone switches. And they, they're not worried about how to interact with databases because they don't have a database. I mean, it's totally different things that people are caring about. So as a result, I think it's important that the first thing we have to say about architecture is you have to figure out what is important in your particular context. And yeah, there's similarities between contexts, but you have to first decide as a group of people what really matters, because you can't worry about everything. You have to figure out what are the most important things that you have to worry about. And that really becomes the thing that you then have to focus on.
That clarifies a little bit about this. And however, I think there should be some commonalities, some common thing across teams that why is important for them. For instance, I think one of the things that I have seen is that to be business driven is a common thing, right, between them. So what is important? It could be like availability, it could be databases, as you mentioned, it could be integration, whatever. But one key part, and at least that is my interpretation, that what is the relevance of architecture is because it needs to be business driven, right?
Yes, yeah, I very much, I mean, again, we tend to work in a commercial space. Again, if you're a telephone switch, then I mean, there are business drivers, but they're a bit more abstract. But the thing is about our work is that trying to understand what the important business drivers are is itself something that's often difficult to figure out. And that's why I do think it's important for software architects to really get into and understand the business in context that they're in. And that's something that traditional organization structures tend to push people apart from, but something that we have to counteract and really make an important part of how we look at software architecture.
Yes, and that an architecture needs to be driven by business. Does it mean that we need to build these domain-driven architectures or something like that, or there are different things?
I don't think, I mean, if we're talking about things like domain-driven design, I think domain-driven design is a very valuable technique for particularly many of the situations that we tend to work in at ThoughtWorks, which are more complex domains. But we also have to remember there are plenty of environments where something simpler is perfectly okay because it's not such a complex problem. But it's just we don't tend to run into that because we tend to tackle more tricky things. But I am in general a big fan of domain-driven design because that's the context that I've often run into, and the context we often run into is exactly the one where that becomes very important.
Yes, that's true. But I like the part that you mentioned that it will depend on the context, and the thing that it will depend on the context is like taking one approach to one context, maybe it's good. Taking the same approach to another context, maybe it's not. So I would like to explore a little bit with you, like what makes an architecture a good architecture? What is a good architecture? And what do you need? What does a team need to do in order to build a good architecture?
Well, I think one of the tests of a good architecture is that all of the members of the team have the same view of what the architecture is, but there is a kind of a common understanding of what the most important aspects of the software are. There was a test that Kent Beck came up with a long time ago, which was to go around every member of the team and ask them to define the system using only 4 objects. And that's an interesting test, because if everybody picks, at least mostly the same 4, then you've had that common view. But what is important is that we have that similarity, that everybody's kind of focused on the main interactions and sees them in pretty much the same way. Another aspect that I think is important, certainly for the kinds of things that we do, is the evolvability of an architecture, the fact that a system is easy to change, often in unexpected ways, because the business drivers often change in unexpected ways. And that's a common statement that goes with architecture. Architecture is the stuff that's hard to change, is an often used term. And I think it's, although it's secondary to the most important things, it is usually high on the list of most important things. So I think that is a very good guideline. What have you found to be the case in the teams that you've worked with? Because I don't do any real work anymore. I just listen to folks like you. So what do you tend to run into?
Yes, like for me, I have seen like good architectures in this space, especially when we are saying that the business change, the market needs are coming in a new acceleration way, right? So we have more and more requirements coming and more adaptability that we need to require. So I totally agree in that sense that a good architecture is the architecture that allows to respond to these changes in a good way without damaging like the future, right? So for me, the good architecture are all the decisions that we are taking in one moment that could allow us to make these changes in the future easily, right? And in that sense, I would say, like, if we think about architecture in the way that we thought traditionally, like making upfront designs and saying that everything will go in that direction, and trying to keep everything in control from the beginning, versus now going more in an evolutionary way. I would say that these type of architectures that can evolve in a good way, that can evolve in a guided fashion, are the ones that are good, because they allow, and it's connected with the previous point that we said before, that the architecture needs to be business driven, right, and allows to achieve the business outcomes. So that is kind of my way to say what is a good architecture.
Yeah, another one I might throw in as well is how easy it is for people to come onto a team and understand what's going on. I remember a significant piece of re-architecting that was done on a long-term project here at ThoughtWorks. This was many years ago, and even then, the project had been running for, half a dozen years at least. And one of the problems I noticed, it took a very long time to bring a new person into the team before they were really effective. And that was a problem on its own because, you know, any team has a certain flow of people. If it takes many months to get a person to be up to speed, that's an issue. But it's also a sign of a deeper problem, because if architecture is difficult to understand, then that implies it's not terribly good. So they put a lot of effort into improving the architecture and testing, and their test for whether they were improving it is, could they bring people onto the team more rapidly? And so that became an interesting test of the architecture. Can somebody come onto the team and they got it down from, I mean, I can't remember the figures, but it was sort of many months into just a couple of months. And that they felt was a sign that their re-architecting efforts were successful, because they were able to make things much more understandable and allow people to contribute more quickly. So I thought that was an interesting sign of a test of a good architecture. Now, I suppose if you had a team that was extremely stable and never really changed, and you were confident that it was be that way for a long time, that might be less of a factor. And I certainly have run into descriptions, particularly with complicated domain things, where people build a structure that's quite hard to understand, but once you understand it, you can be very, very productive with it. And there's an interesting trade-off there, I think. But I think the idea of testing the quality of an architecture by saying how quickly can people understand it is an interesting test to take on.
Yeah, that's very interesting one. I have never thought about the architecture in those terms. I think when we talk is about, yes, and the decisions, and you're right, is like if we define the architecture as the important stuff, the decisions that we need to make, and how onboard new people. And I think this is especially true nowadays, that at least in my experience doing software, I am seeing this trend in companies. Fortunately, I am in a consultancy company where I can see very many of these realities. But one common thing is about people, that people don't tend to be in the same place for longer terms. And nowadays, it's more often that they transition from one company to another. Actually, I don't know, for 2 to 4 years. And yeah, so that makes sense a lot. And in that sense, I was thinking another attribute about good architectures. And I would say, like, I remember talking to another thought worker, or maybe in the radar conversations, that if you think about the testability, you will end up in a good architecture too, right? Why is it important to have this testability in architecture, Martin?
Well, partly because testability is in itself such a valuable thing, because it allows you to detect problems quickly. And particularly if you're going to have, if you're going to be making changes, you need to be able to tell fast, if you make a change to a system, have I broken anything by accident? And that's, of course, what cripples so many software systems, because people are afraid to change the system because they don't know whether they break anything. And then when they do make a change, they have to really minimize how much change they make. And so they tend to patch a fix on top of the existing stuff. And that putting patch on top of patch on top of patch makes it increasingly hard to make a change. So the system deteriorates because of the fact that people are afraid to change. And so testability can greatly enhance that, can greatly enhance your ability to change, because it allows you to make deeper changes, more widespread changes, and be confident that if your tests pass, then you haven't broken anything. And when you're in that mode of, I can make any change I like across this system, and if my tests pass, I haven't broken anything, you're able to keep the system in a much more healthy state. So that's the first reason I think testability is so important, is because it gives you the crucial foundation to be able to do evolving architecture effectively. But I think there's also a secondary thing about testability, that's why I'm such a fan of approaches like test-driven design, is because it forces you to whenever you're working on a piece of software, your test is how you're going to use that piece of software at some degree of granularity. So at a very low level, if I'm just working at a few functions or a few objects, my tests are exercising those functions and exercising those objects, forcing me to look from the outside and say, does this make a sensible API for the behavior that I'm putting in? And then as I go to a broader level, to a sort of larger component level, it's the same thing. I'm creating an API, and then my tests are exercising that API and telling me, does the API make sense? And because the interface is more important than the internals, because it's harder to change an interface than to change the internals, it's really important that we have that mental looking from the outside point of view. So I think that's the second way that testability helps us. It forces us to look at it from the outside when we're buried on the inside. And so those are two, I think, very good reasons why testability is an important aspect. I mean, is that something that gels with what you've seen?
Yes, absolutely. When we're thinking, for instance, in test-driven design, from the design in more unit perspective, even to the architecture, like once I remember talking and said, why TDD is good? And there was one argument that says, yes, because we will have close to 100% of coverage in our tests. So yes, that is a good outcome as well. It's a good output that we are going to have, like the reliability in our system and the confidence to make changes in the future. That's one. But the other for me, and is what you mentioned. It allows you to design the software in a consumer way, right? So because we are doing something to be consumed, right? When we are talking about, I don't know, like microservices and architectures and APIs, what we are doing actually is something that to be consumed by someone else, right? And if we think from the beginning in how they are going to consume this thing, we're thinking in testability. So making the design of the architecture thinking from that perspective and not what can I provide to the rest, but what they are going to use, it makes a switch that creates value in our designs. That is something, and this is, for instance, one of the things that I want to talk to, that when we're talking about architecture, we're seeing two spectrums, I think. The one is the traditional one when we see all decision needs to be upfront. And then someone could say, like, no decision needs to be upfront, and we're going to discover everything in the way that we're building. But I think there's some value, and there is, let me rephrase, there is a lot of value to make some choices at the beginning when we're doing something like this, for instance. One of our principles is to make it everything testable, right? So in your experience, what you have seen that are good or right upfront decisions, and what are not good upfront decisions?
That's, I guess, getting harder for me as time goes on and I'm less involved with projects from the day-to-day basis. I mean, because a lot of the principles I can tend to look at tend to be these sort of very broad things like testability, like having a high value to naming things so that people understand the names of stuff, and then making sure that the names on the inside of the software are the same names that business people are using, the domain-driven design notion of ubiquitous language. And yeah, so those tend to be, those sort of very broad things tend to be more on my mind. I think it's also important is to understand when you're talking at the beginning of a project is to understand the context of the people involved. So what experience and backgrounds do they have? Because you don't want to begin a project with something that you don't want to launch a project with something that's totally different to what the team currently know about. Or at least if you do, you've got to be very careful doing that. You've got to put in place the necessary structures to control the fact that they're going to be flailing for a while. But you've also got to talk about the wider organization. How well does, what other kinds of software systems are present in the organization? To what extent do we want to follow what other teams do because you've got experience built up, you want a certain degree of commonality. But on the other hand, do you have a particular circumstance with this effort that's new and therefore wants you to try something new? Is there a need to experiment because you want to try something? But that's got to be a thoughtful thing. It can't be just try it because it seems best. So you've got to think about that broader context of how it fits into other things. Those are the things that kind of immediately occur to me. But again, I'm interested to hear sort of what you have on that.
Yes. Yeah. So that's interesting. One thing that you mentioned about maybe what are the team know, what are the team members know about the technology, and choose based on that context. I think that is valuable. And however, I think, for instance, we are in large corporations time to time, right? And there are teams that require some type of architecture, of some type of choices in terms of technology, stack frameworks, because it's what they know or what they want to do. But when you are in a large ecosystem where your decision needs to respond to something larger, not bigger, not just for your team, but for the organization, like you need to be aware of that context, right? Just to put an example, like I remember one team that we had and say like, okay, we feel very comfortable doing Clojure and functional programming for this specific thing. However, the large organization required to hire new people because of this decision, because they need to maintain in the future, right? So again, for me, these are the kind of decisions that will impact the business, and architecture need to be a business driven, not just business requirements driven, but the business ecosystem as well, right? And so these type of decisions for me are important ones. For instance, like, okay, we're an ecosystem. What are the requirements? What is your context now? Where are your capabilities as an organization? Where do you want to go in the future outside just of this context? So that allows me to say, okay, we need this kind of stack because it will respond to a larger vision of this organization, right? It is not just for the context of the team. So in summary, I think those are the kind of decisions that add value for the team and for the organization.
That's a good example and an interesting example of, for something like Clojure, for instance, which is a very different language to what a lot of people are used to if they're used to the traditional C-based languages. It also is a language that forces you into the functional, very immutability everywhere kind of mindset, which makes it a bit of a stretch. I mean, than other language changes. I mean, the difference between Java and Kotlin, for instance, isn't really that great, but the difference between either of those and Clojure is really quite huge. So there's an argument there, quite a reasonable argument, says, well, you've got to be very wary about putting that into an organization because it's going to be quite shit for people to switch from one to the other. But there's also another layer of argument on top of this that might say, well, if we want, it is important for any organization, I think, to have good engineers working in it, to increase the technical capability and skills. And one of the most important ways for a software developer to build up their skills is to explore different ways of thinking about problems and how to program problems. And one of the best ways to get that experience is to be dropped into a very different programming language environment that forces you to program differently, which is kind of what Clojure does. So there's an argument that might say, well, maybe we want some of our systems in Clojure, partly because it suits what the system needs to do, but part of a deliberate environment to say, we need to rotate people through this closure project so that they spend 6 months or whatever on there, and that allows them to stretch their abilities and learn new skills by thinking about software in a different kind of way. Then they'll go back to their regular environment. But as anybody will say, if they've spent time programming in this very sort of forced different manner, suddenly when you even go back to your familiar environment, you've got another way of looking at problems that can be very useful. So, I mean, and this is then is a very interesting aspect of saying to yourself, well, when we look at our software landscape, we also have to think of it not just as the systems that keep us going, but an important part of the systems that keep us going is how do we ensure our internal development teams are strong enough? And maybe we need to ensure that there's enough variety in our systems to give them that ability to do that. Now, that only works if you make it a deliberate part of your policy. If you say to yourself, well, anybody who we think is has the capacity to be a more senior engineer, they have to go into these unusual projects for a period of time so that they can stretch and learn. It's part of their growth. And I think that's probably going to be a stretch for a lot of organizations to be thinking in that kind of way. But it is actually what a lot of organizations do with people in management positions. They'll deliberately put people into different environments so that they see the broader range of what they have to deal with. And that can be a very useful thing. So I'm not going to say that fault of mine is completely well worked out. It only really occurred to me as we were talking about it. But I think it's something to bear in mind. I mean, because I mean, look at the strength that we have. I mean, do you see that we gain our developers gain ability by being pushed into these different kinds of projects that as part of the general work that we do as a consulting organization? Is that the case, do you think?
I think I don't know exactly in that part, and I am thinking more in the space like, yes, you need these type of organizations, and I have seen these kind of organizations where actually the teams can solve the problem with the best tool possible to solve that problem and make those cultural changes inside the organization to actually start to make this possible, right? And these kind of decisions that you're thinking about, architectural choices or framework choices or whatever, it impacts like the culture and how the organizations needs to behave in terms of people, what they value, why they don't value, how to move people and how to cultivate their own people inside different environments. In the other hand, and I think we have seen this and we have promoted this kind of architectures, like more modular architectures, where you can choose safely, like one type of tool or framework versus other, and be very productive in different ways. However, it brings a challenge as well, right? So when you have this autonomy in the teams, and you need to think in some way where they can get the best of the tools, however, don't go in a wild, like making random choices around because they feel that they need to do these kind of things. And I don't know, an organization that have made Java for a long time and then they decide to go to C#, that is basically the same paradigm, the same things, why they are choosing these things. So in those situations, I think more beyond all the culture and the cultivation that one person can go from one side to another, you need some of the governance as well to make this thing happen, right? But maybe not governance in the old way that we perceive, like the command and control governance, but different. I like one of your articles that you describe this governance and the role of the architect to building bridges across teams and instead of controlling, teaching. So can you share your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think, well, it comes down to that we want to have teams be autonomous, but we also need these autonomous teams to be aligned in roughly the same direction. So it's this kind of balance of autonomy and alignment. And what kinds of tools can we use to try and build that alignment without sort of laying down laws of people? I think that's, for instance, one of the big values of that we've seen people find with using radars. I mean, we developed the radar initially just to try and figure out what on earth was going on in Fort Worth. But we found a lot of clients find a lot of value in a radar by getting explicit about what are the technologies that are the kind of the base technologies that people can just use, what technologies should people be perhaps begin experimenting with, and what the state of these various things are. So that when they make decisions about technologies, they're not just thinking in the context of one particular team, but they are thinking about the team in the context of the broader organization. And so I think the radar can be a very useful tool as part of that. Although the way you use a radar within an organization is actually kind of different to the way that we do it. But the same tool can be used in kind of these two different ways, and which is interesting. Another thing that's quite idea is the idea of thinking in terms of architectural principles. Unfortunately, there isn't really a great thing written down on this yet. There is a talk that Birgitta Böckler, our colleague from Germany, did. I think the reference to it is on the website somewhere if you search for architectural principles. And what we're trying to look at there is, again, fairly broad terms of the kinds of things that you're looking at, without trying to get down into specifics. And I really want to come up with an example, and I'm blanking on one at this point. But again, we're trying to set fairly broad rules rather than getting down into that kind of more micro management area. Those are a couple of things that I've run into, at least.
Yes, in this term principles, that's very interesting. What is the difference about a principle and a rule or a standard? Like, where is or are the same thing?
This is where I'm blanking out on my memory of what we had for when we came up with some of them for Birgitta's talk. And
yeah, what I was thinking about the rules and principles somehow is that, because I used to work in a very strict organization where we were like following wonderful principles, and we have the board of architects long time ago joined ThoughtWorks. And one of the things is that we used to have rules, right? And for me, the difference between, and maybe in Spanish there is a different term, but the thing is, like, they were very prescriptive on the ways that you need to do things, versus, and were controlled by someone else, every single decisions that you were made, and a way to control the rules are being followed. Versus when I, for instance, go in a company and I see these principles, right? So like something like, I don't know, one of the principles is testability, for instance, like make your all applications testable, right? Is not a rule, is not specifically how you need to do these kind of things, that you need to test by the framework ABC and needs to complete the black box and the white box testing and these kind of things. But it's a principle, it's a broader thing that the teams need to take in mind. Is something that you were thinking of?
Yeah, I mean principles. I mean, some of the principles that I tend to follow are fairly broad principles. For instance, try to one principle is that I don't have non-UI aspects of the software depending upon aspects in the UI. So that I always have it. The user interface. Any user interface should always depend on more internal stuff and not the other way around. And furthermore, I try to move logic out of user interface stuff into other elements, so that partly because that makes it much easier for testing, but partly to just so that I can separate when I'm thinking about different aspects of the problem, the non-UI parts from the UI aspects. That's a very broad principle, but principles can also be much more narrow. You might, on a particular project team, say, we don't want to have very much we don't want to have very much execution going on in the website. So we want to have most of the server to generate most of the HTML and use a minimal amount of JavaScript and try to use as much as possible HTML elements and CSS rather than doing things in JavaScript. I mean, a different team might go the other point of view and say, hey, we don't want to use CSS. We want to do all our CSS in JavaScript, for instance. But I mean, what is important is, I mean, we can argue about which of those two principles is better, but what's important is that a particular team picks one way or the other to go, because if you've got a mishmash in different places, it's going to make it confusing for people to do things. So those, for instance, could be good principles. You could have observability principles and say, you know, whenever you're doing anything that's going to change the state of any business data in the system, make sure that it gets logged in some way. There may be principles about when do you do logging, how often do you log in, are certain particular things necessary to be logged. In a world where observability becomes more important, those kinds of principles become important. I mean, the test of good principles is, does it help you make decisions? Can you, instead of having to try and figure things out from first principles, can you have an easier decision process because you say, oh, these are the principles that this project team follows? Another set of principles that, again, at a more lower level, but a very important level, are naming conventions. What kinds of naming conventions do we follow? So that I can comfortably go into a bit of code that you've written that I haven't seen before, and I'm going to recognize how it works because we're following the same names. And that's an important thing because, you know, we all develop our different writing styles, but once we're on a team, we have to separate our personal preferences from the preferences that the team will follow. And so we have to go in with the team's way of doing things.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And just to finish, this conversation was about the software architecture and the role of the architect. So we have talked about architecture and what are the things that needs to be in place. Is the architect the responsible to make these principles? Is the architect the responsible to make all these decisions? Or how do you see this role of the architect in this environment now? What you have, because you talk with a lot of people inside ThoughtWorks about the different kind of things that they are doing. Like, what is the trend that you see in the role of the architect now?
Well, for me, I mean, the architect is the sort of the technical leader of a team. And their role is very much focused on identifying those most important aspects of software and making sure that it stays healthy. And a very important part of that is ensuring that the team learns how to do things. I've often argued that the best architect is the one that makes the least decisions, because all the decisions have been correctly made by everybody else on the team, so they don't have to make any decisions. And I think that's true of leaders in general. The ideal leader doesn't do anything because they've got everybody else all working in the right sense, so that there are no difficult decisions left to make because everybody else has made the right ones before they even get up to the leader. Now that's obviously an ideal because it's kind of difficult to achieve, but that's where you want to work to, right? You want to minimize what you need to do. And there is, I think, this nice self-contradictory element. And it's why when we come back earlier on, we talked about how a common principle in software architecture is stuff that is difficult to change is the architectural stuff. And of course, that leads to the same argument that the best architects, if everything's easy to change, then there's no architecture. So you want to kind of minimize it, right? And again, I think it's a case of wherever you see problems and difficulties, you want to minimize them. So you want to you want to see what's the cause of those things that are getting in your way, How do we get rid of those? And so an architect should always be looking for what are the root causes of the problems that we're dealing with as a team, and how can we eliminate those, or at least mitigate them to a reasonable extent.
And that's a very interesting topic, and yeah, I would like to have more hours to talk about this. Every single time that we talk, we tend to go in various directions, and that is great. So thanks, Martin. I think we're finishing with this conversation now, and right now it's time for questions. I think we have a couple of ones made for you. So, question for Martin. I am seeing that some developers and teams tend to fanaticize the application of domain-driven design or event-driven architectures over simple options or approaches. What would you recommend to prevent this?
Well, I mean, it's always, again, it's going to come very definitely down to looking at the people. Certainly, I'm a big fan when it comes to architectural principles of the one referred to as Yagni, which is to say, don't build anything in until you actually really have a good need for it. And I slightly temper this with, well, what would it take to refactor towards something more complicated later on? And imagine what that refactoring would look like. And what you do is you find that 9 times out of 10, the refactoring actually isn't that hard. So you definitely don't need to do it now. And then if it is going to be something that's hard, maybe you find that only a small amount of thing that you need to do now is enough to make it easy in the future. You only do the stuff that makes it easy in the future. But it is a tricky thing because people do gravitate toward, they do worry about the complications that can grow later on, and we're not very good at predicting those. But you do have to kind of, and so I'm burbling because it so much depends on the people, and I'm not necessarily that persuasive anyway.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I think, and yesterday we had a chat in Slack about, and you can say everything about like domain-driven design, event-driven architectures, microservices, platform thinking that the people used to try to do without a need or without knowing all the implications that needs to be in place, right? So like some of these principles, for instance, I remember talking to Neil for some time and say like, start simply, as simple as possible, and then we'll add more things in the time that you will need. And just to finish, Martin, this is the last one for you. Is there a path or a way to become a good architect? How a software developer can build that skill and become software architect? Any advice?
Yeah, probably one of the most important things to do is to find a good, experienced software developer who is clearly good at their job and reasonably good at explaining things to you, and learn from them. Find mentors. A good mentor can take you a long, long way. And that's, first off, something I would recommend. Another is to make sure that you try different things. So like my example early on of plunging yourself into a language environment that's very different to the one that you're familiar with. Seek those out. Don't, particularly early on in your career, don't get set in a single language or a single framework. Try different things, because that way you'll get to look at things from different angles. Later on, you can spend more time in a single area, but early on in particular, I think it's important to get that variety. But a good mentor should push you in that direction anyway, by saying, oh, you need to experience some of this, you need to experience some of that. And always remember that as you become more experienced, mentoring other people, not just does that pass on the knowledge that you have, but it actually helps you. One of the most valuable things you gain from teaching other people is understanding things yourself. And that's not immediately obvious, but often the best way you can have to understand something new is to actually force yourself to teach it to someone else, because then you realize some of the gaps yourself.
That's absolutely true. And I think one part of to become a software architect is not just about technology, it's about people, it's about how to teach, how to mentor. And I think we need to talk more about this topic. Like in technical conference, we don't used to talk a lot about this. But I think that's it. Thank you very much, Martin. Thank you, everyone. It has been a pleasure to have this conversation. Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.